Rameshwar had told me there was no longer a place in ISKCON for devotees like me, who were stuck living in the past. And sadly, at that time in 1985, he was right. And what sort of devotee was I that he was referring to? Someone someone he saw as being stuck living in the past was someone who wouldn't give up wanting to fulfill Srila Prabhupada's instructions. Someone who still saw that ISKCON belonged to Srila Prabhupada. Someone who wanted Srila Prabhupada to remain in the center of ISKCON. Someone who refused to remove Srila Prabhupada from the center of our own lives. Someone who refused to let Srila Prabhupada die in our hearts, where he was still very much alive via his eternal instructions. Someone who refused to think of Srila Prabhupada as being dead and gone. Someone who refused to let the poison that these men were trying to force us to take by trying to convince us that Srila Prabhupada instructions were no longer relevant to his ISKCON mission. But the most sad fact was, he was right. There no longer was a place in their ISKCON for devotees like us. If nothing else, this story will show, you can show to devotees how bad things had become for many of Prabhupada's own disciples under this GBC's zonal acharya system. And why devotees rose up to force the GBC to finally put an end to that system in ISKCON. These men, or at least many of them, had become so fallen and they were totally destroying Srila Prabhupada's mission. I was still standing over Rameshwar, and I told him, I can never leave Srila Prabhupada or his mission. Instead, it's time for you to leave. I was certain that after saying this, his disciples would jump up and drag me outside and beat me. But again, nobody moved. And if they had, I didn't care. I couldn't remain silent anymore and say nothing at all after hearing what he had said. I had no tolerance for being told to no longer follow Srila Prabhupada. After several seconds of silence, Rameshwar panned the room. I think he was surprised that no one had jumped up to physically attack me. He then asked me to leave his room, to take the BBT van that I had driven him in to Laguna and go back to the LA temple without him, which I did. The next day, I marched into his office reception area, past his secretaries who were too slow to stop me because I just came right in, walked right into Rameshwar's private office. And when Rameshwar saw me, he looked like a scared deer caught in the headlights of a car. He was just stood there frozen, the look of fear on his face, wondering what I was going to do to him. I told him that when I was working in the Detroit Museum, I had been told that once the work was completed that I and my wife would get tickets to go to India and South Africa, which is where she was from. I went there to demand that he give me those tickets. He sighed a sigh of relief, relief that I hadn't barged in there to cause him bodily harm. And he told me, yes, that's a brilliant idea. The BBT will pay for your tickets and you travel anywhere you want. You just find another zone and go there and move. He said, please, just go to Bhagawan zone. He knew that Bhagawan had been asking me to come there. I then went to India, and then Europe and South Africa. And when in India at the Mayapur festival, Harikesh walked up to me to inform me that at the GBC meetings that day, they had elected me to become the worldwide ISKCON Minister of Audiovisual Production. And my first assignment was to make a large presentation for the Lord Chaitanya's 500th Appearance Day celebration that was to be held in Mayapur the next year. I know that was Rameshwar who convinced the GBC to do this, because I had told him that I wasn't going to produce shows for just his zone. And part of my rebuke was that the Fate Museum Project was an international project created by Srila Prabhupada for producing museums for the whole of Prabhupada's mission, ISKCON mission. And it was a worldwide project, not for any one temple or any one GBC zone. So in electing me to become the Minister for Audiovisual Production, which was to include the multimedia museum projects, the FATE projects, the GBC noted that the work I did would be for all of Srila Prabhupada's temples and zones worldwide. And again, I'm sure that came from Rameshwar. At least my message got through to him. And while I very much was honored by this, by their awarding me that position, and I looked forward to making those presentations and building museums all over the world, and carrying out that service, the position was very short-lived. After this, after India, on the way back, I went to Bhagawan zone. And I was going to move to his zone and set up production there. When I got, and so I went to his zone for a little while and checked it out, and then went back to the LA temple to wrap things up and prepare to move to Europe. But when I was visiting Bhagawan in England, I observed him. What I considered he had too intimate of a dealings for a sannyasi with some of the Matajis. So when I got back to America, I wrote him a short letter. And I tried to be as respectful as I could. But as his godbrother, I reminded him that as a sannyasi in Lord Chaitanya's movement, he needed to be more strict or he would risk falling down. I told him that I didn't want to see him fall down and I was only trying to be helpful. And I was sincerely concerned. He did not receive that advice well at all. Rather than sending me the tickets to come to his zone, a month later, he called me to inform me that due to my insubordination and refusal to first surrender to Rameshwar and now to him, he took that as a insubordinate refusal to surrender to him by my writing him a letter to just try to give him a little good advice and out of concern for him. He was having me blacklisted. And he said, I will never be allowed to do service in ISKCON again. He told me that I was now officially considered a fringe devotee. That became a new term in those days. A devotee who was just living on the fringe. They were no longer really active in ISKCON, but they still considered themselves a devotee, a disciple of Prabhupada, but they were no longer living within and doing active within ISKCON. There was a lot of fringe devotees because they had to leave because of the whole madness of that zonal acharya system. I don't mean there was a lot, but there were a lot of devotees that had to live out on the fringe because of this. So he considered me, he said, you are officially considered a fringe devotee. And all because I was just genuinely concerned for his spiritual well-being. And I knew if he didn't correct his behavior, he would fall down. Just of note, even though Rameshwar had told me to bloop and leave ISKCON, and Bhagawan followed up and told me he no longer considered me part of ISKCON, I never left. I never left ISKCON, but a year later, both of them resigned their post and left, at least for many, many years.